He left her under fluorescent hospital lights, still wearing a patient wristband while signing his name beside her best friend's on a marriage license across town. Nurses paused. No one intervened. Joseph spoke calmly, as if dignity were negotiable. Rebecca stood close enough to make the choice unmistakable. Stella didn't argue. She watched memorized and said nothing. No one in that room knew she was hours away from authorizing a $600 million deal, one that did not include him. If you believe silence is not weakness, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I read every comment. And if stories about truth, patience, and justice matter to you, consider subscribing. No one ever described Stella Carter as warm. They used other words, instead precise, composed, distant. In the upper tiers of New York's legal and financial circles, those traits were often mistaken for a lack of feeling. But Stella had never needed to correct anyone. Misinterpretation, she had learned early, was a kind of quiet protection. She moved through rooms without announcing herself. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was rarely to persuade, only to clarify. That distinction alone had unsettled more people than she realized. Her office overlooked the East River, a view she barely registered anymore. The desk was always orderly documents, aligned notes handwritten in a consistent narrow script, every meeting logged with time, context, and follow-up. She did not trust memory alone. Memory softened things. Records did not. That habit had begun long before Joseph. Joseph Whitmore entered Stella's life the way he entered most spaces, with ease. He knew how to make people feel seen in the first 5 minutes. He remembered names, laughed at the right moments, and had the particular confidence of someone who had rarely been denied access. To many, they made sense together. Stella's stillness balanced Joseph's movement. Her restraint complemented his sociability. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. But balance requires mutual awareness. And over time, Joseph had mistaken Stella's quiet for absence. He did not notice how often she observed him, how she tracked the shift in his tone when he spoke to people he considered useful versus those he did not. He did not notice how her gaze lingered, not on his words, but on the pauses between them. He certainly did not notice when she began writing more. Rebecca Lawson had been in Stella's life even longer than Joseph. They had met years earlier during a transitional period neither of them spoke about in detail. Rebecca was everything Stella was not: outwardly effortless in conversation, quick with humor, fluent in emotional language. She knew how to bridge silence, how to soften tension, how to make others feel included. It made her welcome everywhere. When Stella introduced Rebecca to Joseph, it had seemed natural. There was no calculation in it. Rebecca adapted quickly to Joseph's rhythm, matching his energy, responding to his stories with visible enthusiasm. Where Stella would nod and remember, Rebecca would laugh and affirm. Joseph noticed that. At first, it was subtle. Rebecca began appearing more frequently, joining dinners, attending events, stepping into conversations that once belonged to 2 people instead of 3. She framed it as support. Joseph framed it as ease. Stella did not frame it at all. She watched. In the months leading up to the hospital night, Stella's schedule had grown increasingly dense. The transaction she was working on was not something that could be discussed openly even within her own home. Layers of confidentiality surrounded it, corporate, legal, and personal. The deal itself, valued at just over $600 million, involved a strategic acquisition that would restructure several regional logistics networks. It had taken years to assemble negotiations, regulatory considerations, financial modeling, and quiet alignment among stakeholders who preferred discretion over publicity. Stella was not simply part of that process. She was the final authority on it. The structure had been designed that way long ago under the direction of her father, Richard Carter. He had not believed in shared control when it came to foundational decisions. And more importantly, he had not believed in access without understanding. Stella had inherited both his position and his caution. Joseph knew about the deal in fragments, enough to recognize its scale, not enough to understand its structure. He assumed proximity meant inclusion. It did not. Around the same time, small inconsistencies began appearing in places Stella rarely needed to question. A transfer from a joint account that did not align with any scheduled expense. A credit authorization that had been requested but not discussed. An email notification referencing a login from a device she did not recognize. None of it was dramatic. Each instance could have been explained in isolation. And that was precisely why Stella did not confront any of it. She documented date, time, amount, source. She cross-referenced statements with access logs, compared timestamps with Joseph's stated whereabouts. Not because she expected immediate answers, but because she understood that patterns required accumulation. Joseph, meanwhile, grew increasingly impatient with her silence. You don't react to anything he had said one evening, standing in the kitchen while she reviewed a set of printed documents. It's like talking to someone who's already decided the outcome. Stella had looked up briefly, not defensive, not dismissive, just present. I prefer to understand the situation before responding to it. Joseph exhaled, frustrated in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Not everything is a situation to analyze, Stella. Some things are just people. She had returned her attention to the page. And people still leave patterns. It was not an argument. It was an observation. But Joseph did not hear it that way. Rebecca, when told about these moments, responded differently. She doesn't mean to be cold, she told him once, her voice soft, reassuring. She just doesn't express things the way most people do. Joseph nodded, grateful for the interpretation. Rebecca understood him. That was how it felt. What Joseph did not see was that Rebecca had begun asking questions, careful ones framed casually. How intense is that deal she's working on? Does it involve equity or just advisory work? Do you think it'll change things for you financially? Each question seemed harmless on its own. Curiosity, nothing more. Joseph answered more than he should have, filling in gaps with assumption where he lacked certainty. He spoke in projections, not facts. But projections repeated often enough begin to resemble truth, especially to someone willing to believe them. Stella never asked what they discussed. She did not need to. There were moments, though, when even her composure showed strain. Late nights became later. Meals were skipped or forgotten. Her handwriting, once uniform, occasionally pressed harder into the page. The ink slightly darker, where the pen lingered too long. She began waking earlier, reviewing notes before sunrise. Cross-checking timelines, not just for the deal, but for everything surrounding it, including her own marriage. The realization did not arrive as a single dramatic conclusion. It formed slowly across pages of observation. Joseph was no longer aligned with her. Not in priority, not in perspective, and increasingly not in loyalty. Still, she said nothing. The week before the scheduled signing window was the most critical. Final confirmations needed to be secured. Legal documents required last-stage verification. Stakeholders expected clarity, not delay. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. Stella understood that pressure. She had built her life around carrying it. But pressure, when unacknowledged physically, finds other ways to surface. On the morning it happened, there was no warning dramatic enough to mark the moment as significant. A slight dizziness while standing. A pause that lasted longer than usual. The room tilting just enough to disrupt balance. She steadied herself against the edge of her desk, her breathing controlled but uneven. For a few seconds, she remained still, allowing the sensation to pass. It didn't. By the time she reached for her phone, her vision had begun to narrow, not entirely, but enough to recognize that this was no longer something to document later. It required immediate attention. Even then, she did not panic. She noted the time, she locked her screen, and she called for help. The rest would unfold quickly, but not unpredictably. Because even in that moment before the hospital, before Joseph's arrival, before Rebecca's presence, Stella was already aware of one thing. With quiet certainty, what was about to happen had been building for a long time. And whatever broke next would not be the beginning. It would be the exposure. The fractures in Stella and Joseph's marriage did not begin with betrayal. They began with interpretation. Joseph believed he had married a woman who did not need him, not in the ways he understood need. Stella did not ask for reassurance. She did not require constant communication. She did not measure affection through frequency of words or displays of concern. To Joseph, that absence of visible dependence gradually translated into something else: detachment. He did not notice that Stella adjusted quietly around him. When he forgot dinners, she rearranged her schedule without comment. When he canceled plans, she did not question the reason. When he returned late, she did not ask where he had been. To Joseph, this looked like indifference. To Stella, it was restraint. Restraint, however, leaves space. And space, if not understood, invites replacement. Rebecca filled that space without ever appearing to step into it. She never interrupted Stella directly. She never contradicted her in public. Instead, she supplemented conversations, adding tone, where Stella offered clarity, adding warmth, where Stella provided structure. "Stella always thinks 10 steps ahead," Rebecca would say with a light smile. "I just try to keep up." It sounded like admiration. Joseph heard something else: validation. He began seeking Rebecca's reactions more often. A joke that Stella would acknowledge with a brief nod would earn laughter from Rebecca. A concern Stella would process internally became a conversation with Rebecca, expanded, explored, emotionally articulated. Gradually, Joseph stopped bringing certain things to Stella altogether. He told himself it was easier this way. There were evenings when all three of them sat together at restaurants, at small gatherings, even at home. On the surface, nothing was inappropriate. The boundaries were intact, technically, but attention had already begun to shift. Joseph's body angled slightly toward Rebecca when he spoke. His tone softened in ways Stella recognized, but did not comment on. Rebecca, in turn, maintained just enough distance to preserve the appearance of respect, while allowing familiarity to deepen. Stella observed all of it. She noticed how often Rebecca arrived early, how she lingered after conversations ended, how her questions, always gently phrased, began to move from general curiosity into specific territory. How do you manage such large transactions without getting overwhelmed? Does Stella usually handle everything herself, or do you support her more behind the scenes? Do you think things will change for you after this deal goes through? Joseph answered, as he always did, with confidence built on incomplete understanding. "She handles the technical side," he said once, leaning back in his chair. "But at the end of the day, we're a team. What affects her affects me." Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Of course, that makes sense." Stella, seated across from them, said nothing. But later that evening, when she returned to her desk, she wrote down the exchange. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Tone mattered, timing mattered, and repetition mattered most of all. The financial discrepancies appeared around the same time. The emotional distance became undeniable. At first, it was a single transaction, small enough to overlook, categorized under a general expense label. Stella noticed it only because she reviewed statements more carefully than most. Then came another, and another. Different amounts, different dates. No consistent pattern except that none of them had been discussed. Stella did not confront Joseph. Instead, she expanded her review. She accessed archived statements tracing back several months. She compared transaction times with Joseph's calendar entries. She noted overlaps, moments when he claimed to be in one place while financial activity suggested otherwise. Still, she did not conclude. Not yet. Joseph, meanwhile, began to express frustration more openly. "You never asked me anything," he said one night, standing in the doorway of her office. "Do you even care what I do during the day?" Stella looked up from her laptop, her expression neutral. "If there's something you want me to know, you can tell me." "That's not the point," he replied, his voice tightening. "Most people would at least be curious." "Curiosity without context leads to assumptions," she said. "I prefer information." Joseph laughed, but there was no humor in it. You always have an answer, don't you? Stella held his gaze for a moment. No, I just don't respond without one. That distinction, subtle, precise, only widened the gap between them. Rebecca once again became the interpreter. She doesn't mean to shut you out, she told Joseph during a separate conversation. She just processes things differently. You have to meet her where she is. Joseph shook his head. I've been doing that for years. At some point, she has to meet me halfway. Rebecca placed a hand lightly on his arm, brief, reassuring. You deserve to feel understood, too. It was a small gesture, but it lingered longer than it should have. Stella noticed that as well. Not the gesture itself, she had not been present, but the shift in Joseph afterward. The way his tone changed when Rebecca's name appeared in conversation. The way he defended her opinions with a certainty he no longer extended to Stella. Patterns. Always patterns. As the signing window approached, Stella's workload intensified. Meetings extended late into the evening. Calls began earlier in the morning. The margin for distraction narrowed to almost nothing. Joseph interpreted this as further withdrawal. You're never really here anymore, he said one night, his voice quieter now, less confrontational, more resigned. I'm here, Stella replied. Physically, maybe. But that's not the same thing. Stella paused, considering the statement. No, she said. It isn't. Joseph waited for more. It didn't come. What he did not understand, what he never fully allowed himself to see, was that Stella's attention had not diminished. It had redirected, not toward another person, but toward clarity. She had begun to map not just financial inconsistencies, but behavioral ones. Conversations, timings, interactions. Each detail recorded without commentary, without emotional annotation. She did not label actions as betrayal. She labeled them as data. And data, when complete, does not require interpretation. It reveals. The final days before her hospitalization were marked by a quiet acceleration. Rebecca's presence increased. Joseph's absences became more frequent. Financial irregularities, though still subtle, appeared with slightly greater consistency. Stella's notes grew longer. Her handwriting usually even pressed harder into the page. Sleep became secondary. Meals became optional. None of this was visible to Joseph in a way he could recognize. He saw distance. He did not see strain. On the morning, everything shifted. Stella had already reviewed 3 separate document sets before 8 a.m. Her desk was covered in organized stacks, contract summaries, annotated drafts. Her phone buzzed intermittently with confirmations and inquiries. Each one answered with precision, no wasted language. She stood to retrieve a file from the shelf behind her. That was when the dizziness began. It was not sudden enough to alarm, but not mild enough to ignore. She steadied herself, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. Her breathing remained controlled, but something beneath it felt off. Not pain, not exactly. Disruption. She closed her eyes briefly, waiting for equilibrium to return. It didn't. Instead, the room seemed to shift just slightly, but enough to alter depth and distance. Her vision narrowed at the edges, her focus pulling inward. Stella did not panic. She reached for her phone. Her movements were slower now, deliberate in a different way. She unlocked the screen, her thumb steady despite the change in sensation. She noted the time, 8:17 a.m. Then she made the call. Her voice when she spoke was calm. I need assistance. No explanation. No dramatization. Just information. Within minutes, the situation moved beyond her control. But even as others began to respond, voices, movement, urgency, Stella remained aware of one thing. This moment was not isolated. It was connected. To the weeks before. To the patterns she had recorded. To the silence she had maintained. What would happen next would not create something new. It would reveal what had already been forming. And somewhere beyond the immediate concern of her condition, beyond the hospital, she would soon be taken to beyond the people who would arrive or fail to. There was still a deadline approaching, a decision waiting, a signature that only she could give. And for the first time in weeks, Stella allowed herself a single, quiet acknowledgement. Everything was about to surface. By the time Stella arrived at the hospital, the world had narrowed into white light and controlled urgency. Private hospitals in Manhattan were designed to feel less like institutions and more like curated environments. Soft lighting, quiet corridors, discreet staff trained to minimize visible alarm. But even in that carefully managed calm, urgency could not be completely disguised. A nurse guided Stella onto the bed with practiced efficiency. Questions were asked in steady, measured tones. Blood pressure, symptoms, duration, medical history. Stella answered each one precisely. No embellishment, no omission. Any recent stress, the nurse asked, already noting the obvious indicators. Yes, Stella replied. No explanation followed. She was given a wristband, her name, date of birth, a barcode that reduced identity to data for the sake of safety. The band rested loosely against her skin, a quiet symbol of temporary vulnerability. The room settled into a rhythm. Monitors hummed softly. Footsteps passed beyond the door. Curtains shifted occasionally with the movement of air. Stella lay still, her breathing steady now, though her body remained heavy, as if something within it had been recalibrated without her permission. She requested her phone. The nurse hesitated briefly, then handed it over. Stella unlocked the screen, her thumb moving with the same deliberate control it always had. Notifications filled the display, emails, missed calls, calendar alerts. She ignored most of them. Instead, she opened her notes. 8:17 a.m. onset of dizziness, 8:22 a.m. Call placed 8:34 a.m. Arrival at hospital. She paused, then added one more line. Awaiting, not diagnosis, not outcome, just awaiting. Because Stella understood something that others often did not. Events did not exist in isolation. They connected. They revealed. They aligned with patterns already in motion. Joseph arrived at 9:12 a.m. He did not rush into the room. His entrance was controlled, composed as though he had already decided the tone he intended to maintain. He paused briefly at the doorway, taking in the scene, the bed, the monitors, Stella's still form. Concern when it appeared on his face was measured. You should have told me you weren't feeling well, he said, stepping inside. It sounded like care, but it carried the weight of mild irritation. Stella turned her head slightly to look at him. I didn't have enough information to report. Joseph exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It doesn't always have to be about information, Stella. Sometimes it's just about letting someone in. She did not respond. There was nothing to clarify. Joseph shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the monitors, as if they might provide context he lacked. So what did they say, he asked. They're still assessing, right? He nodded, though the answer did not seem to satisfy him. Silence settled between them, not tense, not overtly uncomfortable, but undeniably present. Joseph checked his phone. A message, then another. His attention lingered there for a moment longer than necessary. I have a few things I need to handle, he said, almost as an afterthought. But I'll stay for a bit. Stella watched him. Not the words, the sequence, arrival, statement, distraction, justification, pattern. At 9:26 a.m., there was a soft knock on the door. Rebecca Lawson entered without waiting for a full response. Her presence was immediate, composed, attentive, her expression carefully arranged into concern. Stella, she said softly, moving closer to the bed. I came as soon as I heard. Stella's gaze shifted from Joseph to Rebecca. She noted the timing. 14 minutes. Rebecca's hand rested lightly on the edge of the bed, not touching Stella, but close enough to suggest proximity. How are you feeling? Rebecca asked. Stable, Stella replied. Rebecca nodded, her eyes scanning Stella's face, as if searching for something deeper than the word aloud. You've been pushing yourself too hard, she said gently. I told you this would catch up with you. It sounded like care. It sounded like familiarity. Joseph moved slightly closer to Rebecca, their positions adjusting almost unconsciously into alignment. You see what I mean, he said, his tone directed more toward Rebecca than Stella. She doesn't slow down, ever. Rebecca gave a small, understanding smile. She's always been like that, always. The word lingered, as if history belonged equally to all three of them. Stella said nothing. A nurse entered briefly to check the monitors, her presence interrupting the subtle shift in dynamic. She adjusted a setting, noted something on the chart, then left with a polite nod. The room returned to its previous stillness. But something had changed. Joseph's attention no longer moved between Stella and the situation. It settled on Rebecca. It was not overt. There was no declaration, no explicit gesture, just small things. The way he angled his body, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. The way his frustration, once directed at Stella, found relief in Rebecca's presence. "You shouldn't be dealing with all of this alone," Rebecca said quietly. "I'm not," Stella replied. Joseph let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "Are you sure about that?" It was not a question. It was a statement framed as one. Stella looked at him, her expression unchanged. "I am." Joseph shook his head slightly, turning toward Rebecca. "This is what I mean," he said. "She just shuts everything down." Rebecca placed a hand on his arm, light reassuring. "Hey," she said softly. "This isn't the time." Contact was brief, but it was not missed. Not by Stella, not by the nurse who re-entered moments later, not by the quiet system of observation Stella had maintained for years. Time moved differently after that. Conversations became less direct. Joseph spoke more to Rebecca than to Stella. Rebecca responded with careful balance, supportive without overstepping, attentive without appearing intrusive. To an outside observer, it might have looked like concern shared between friends. To Stella, it looked like alignment. At 10:03 a.m., Joseph's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped toward the door. "I need to take this," he said. He didn't wait for a response. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Rebecca remained. For a moment she stood in silence, her posture relaxed, but her attention focused. Then she spoke. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know." Stella looked at her. "I don't." Rebecca's smile was gentle, almost sympathetic. "It just seems that way sometimes." Stella held her gaze. Perception often differs from structure. Rebecca tilted her head slightly as if considering the response. "You always speak like that," she said. "Like everything has a system behind it." "It does." Rebecca's expression shifted, subtle but present. "Not everything." Stella did not argue, because some systems revealed themselves without discussion. Joseph returned several minutes later, his demeanor slightly altered, more decisive, less conflicted. "I'm going to step out for a bit," he said, not looking directly at Stella. "There's some things I need to take care of." Rebecca nodded immediately. "I'll go with you." The words came easily, too easily. Joseph did not hesitate. "Okay." He turned toward Stella then, as if remembering the role he was expected to perform. "They'll take care of you here," he said. "I'll check in later." It was not unkind. It was not harsh. It was simply final. In that moment. In that room. Under fluorescent light and quiet observation, a choice was made, not announced, not explained, but visible. Joseph stepped toward the door. Rebecca followed. Neither looked back. The door closed, and the room returned to stillness. Stella remained where she was, the soft hum of the monitors filling the space they had left behind. She did not call after them. She did not reach for her phone. She did not adjust her position. She simply lay there, observing, recording, understanding. Because what had just happened was not sudden. It was not unexpected. It was not even unclear. It was in its own way confirmed. By the time Stella was discharged, the narrative had already begun to form without her. It moved quickly, as narratives often do, when built on confidence rather than verification. Joseph and Rebecca did not announce anything explicitly at first. They didn't need to. Their appearances together were enough. The frequency, the proximity, the timing, those details spoke in ways words did not. A photo surfaced online 3 days after the hospital. Rebecca standing beside Joseph at a rooftop gathering, her hand resting lightly against his arm. The caption was simple: grateful for clarity, for choosing what feels right. There was no mention of Stella. There didn't need to be. The comments filled in the space: support, encouragement, assumptions disguised as certainty. You deserve happiness. Some people just grow apart. Finally choosing yourself. Joseph did not correct any of it. He let the interpretation settle. Let it spread. Let it harden into something that resembled truth. When he did speak about Stella, it was controlled, measured. She's been distant for a long time, he told a mutual acquaintance over lunch. Focused on her work. We tried to make it work, but you can't build something alone. The phrasing was careful, not accusatory, just enough to shift responsibility without appearing to do so. Rebecca echoed the sentiment when asked. She's incredibly strong, she said, her tone thoughtful, but sometimes strength can look like absence. Again, no direct criticism, just implication. Together, they constructed a version of events that required no confrontation from Stella to be accepted, and Stella offered none. She returned to her apartment the afternoon of her discharge. The space was as she had left it, orderly, quiet, untouched by the movement happening beyond its walls. Her bag rested by the door for a moment before she picked it up again and carried it inside. She did not sit down immediately. Instead, she moved through the apartment slowly, her gaze passing over familiar surfaces. The desk, the shelves, the narrow stack of documents she had left mid-review days earlier. Nothing had changed, except context. She set her phone on the table and opened her laptop. There were messages waiting, from colleagues, from unknown numbers, from people who had seen fragments of something and wanted to confirm the rest. She did not respond. Not yet. Instead, she accessed her accounts, bank statements, joint accounts first, then individual. She began with the most recent activity. The transactions she had noted before her hospitalization were still there, unchanged, uncorrected, unexplained. But now, with uninterrupted time and full access, she could expand her review. She downloaded statements, cross-referenced dates, tagged entries that deviated from established patterns. A transfer labeled as a consulting fee that had no corresponding contract. A series of smaller withdrawals spaced just far enough apart to avoid immediate attention. Charges linked to locations Joseph had not mentioned. She built a timeline. Date, amount, location, method. Then she overlaid that with her existing notes. Where Joseph had said he was, who he had been with, what had been discussed. The overlaps were not dramatic. They didn't need to be. Consistency was more revealing than scale. Her phone buzzed. A message from Joseph. We should talk. This isn't how I wanted things to unfold. Stella read it once. Then she set the phone face down, not as a dismissal, as a delay, because timing, she understood, mattered more than reaction. Another message followed minutes later. I think we both know this has been coming for a while. That one she did not open immediately. Not because she needed distance, but because she already knew what it would say. Instead, she opened her email. There among the unread messages was one marked with a familiar subject line. Final confirmation window. Carter Logistics acquisition. She opened it. The language was precise as always. The final signing window would open in 4 days. All preparatory documentation had been reviewed and approved. Remaining steps required confirmation of authority and availability. Her authority, her availability. Nothing in the message referenced her personal circumstances, because they were irrelevant to the structure of the deal. Stella read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to a private address, to herself archived separately from her primary account. Documentation she had learned should never exist in only one place. Her laptop screen reflected faintly in the window beside her. Outside, the city moved without pause. Inside, Stella continued. She accessed her email archives, search terms entered with precision. Joseph's name, Rebecca's name. Filtered by date, filtered by keyword. Threads appeared, Some expected, others less so. Messages that had been forwarded, details shared that should have remained internal. Not the full scope of the deal Joseph had never had access to. That but enough fragments to suggest that boundaries had been crossed. Carefully, gradually, she downloaded those as well, saved them, categorized them. Her notes expanded. Not emotional, structural. At 6:42 p.m., her phone rang. Rebecca? Stella let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Rebecca," said, her voice soft, controlled. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Stable, Stella replied. There was a brief pause. "I'm glad to hear that," Rebecca said. That day at the hospital, it was a lot. It was. Another pause. "I hope you don't feel like I handled that poorly," Rebecca added. Everything happened so quickly. Stella did not respond immediately. She considered the phrasing. Handled that? As if it had been a situation requiring management. As if presence or absence had been logistical, not chosen. "I understand the sequence," Stella said. Rebecca exhaled softly, as if relieved. "That's all I wanted," she said. Clarity. Stella glanced at her screen, at the files open before her, at the timelines forming. "Clarity," she repeated. They ended the call shortly after. No confrontation, no accusation, nothing that could be interpreted beyond the surface of the words exchanged. But beneath that surface structure was tightening. That evening, Stella made one more call. The number was not saved under a name, but she knew it. It connected on the second ring. "Eleanor Hayes," the voice on the other end answered. "Stella Carter," Stella said. A brief pause. "Then I was expecting your call." Eleanor Hayes was not known for dramatic responses. She was known for precision, for restraint, for outcomes that did not require explanation once delivered. "I'll send you a file," Stella said. "Preliminary. Understood. It includes financial discrepancies, communication records, timeline correlations." "Good." Another pause. "Do you want to proceed immediately?" Eleanor asked. Stella looked at the screen again, at the email confirming the signing window, at the date, at the alignment. "No," she said. Then when Stella closed her laptop slowly, after confirmation, Eleanor did not ask what confirmation meant. She didn't need to. "Then we prepare," she said. The call ended. The apartment returned to silence. Stella stood for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. Then she picked up her notebook, turned to a new page, and wrote, "Hospital confirmed departure. Observed narrative in motion. Assets under review authority, pending execution." She paused, then added one final line. "Timing critical because what Joseph and Rebecca believed had already been decided had not yet." The following morning began without urgency. That more than anything allowed Stella to work with clarity. There were no calls she needed to take immediately. No meetings scheduled that required her voice. The world for a brief window had stopped asking for her response. So she used the silence. Her laptop opened to a clean workspace. Files from the previous night remained organized in labeled folders, transactions, communications, timeline, correlations. Each category subdivided, each entry tagged with date and context. Stella did not revisit what she had already confirmed. She expanded. She began with access logs. Systems Joseph had occasionally used, shared devices, secondary accounts, platforms he believed were peripheral. Stella knew better. Peripheral systems often revealed more than primary ones. They were used carelessly. She cross-checked login times against IP records. Locations surfaced. Not always exact, but consistent enough to narrow patterns. One login from a midtown address Joseph had never mentioned. Another from a residential network that did not correspond to any property they owned. Stella marked them. Then she moved to calendar discrepancies. Joseph's entries had grown increasingly vague in recent months. Client meeting, late dinner, follow-up, non-specific language, easily adjustable. But timestamps could not be adjusted as easily once recorded elsewhere. She aligned those entries with transaction records. A dinner charge placed at 9:14 p.m. on a night he had claimed to be in a meeting until 10:00. A rideshare receipt logged at 11:02 p.m. destination, matching the same residential network flagged earlier. Patterns. Again. She did not annotate them with judgment, only alignment. Her phone remained silent for most of the morning. Joseph had not called again. Rebecca had not followed up. The absence was not surprising. Distance once chosen often sustains itself. At 10:37 a.m., Stella received a notification. A new email. Subject line, supplemental documentation, request authorization confirmation. She opened it immediately. The message was brief. Final stage verification required a direct confirmation of authority from Stella prior to execution. No proxies, no delegation. Standard procedure for transactions of this scale. But in Stella's case, it carried additional weight. Because the structure designed years earlier did not recognize marital extension of authority, Joseph's assumptions, though never formally stated, had always leaned in that direction. He believed proximity would convert into access. The system did not. Stella replied with a single sentence. Confirmation will be provided within the designated window. No elaboration, no delay, just acknowledgement. She archived the message, then continued. The next layer required more attention. Communication records, not the obvious ones, emails sent directly between Joseph and Rebecca. Those Stella suspected would be cautious. Instead, she searched for indirect overlap, shared references, forwarded threads, language patterns. She filtered emails by keyword, schedule update review, then cross-referenced send times. Several threads emerged. On the surface, they appeared unrelated business updates, logistical notes, general coordination. But when placed side by side, subtle connections formed. Rebecca responding to information she should not have had. Joseph forwarding fragments of internal discussions under neutral subject lines. Not enough to reveal the full scope of Stella's work, but enough to suggest access beyond what had been appropriate. Stella downloaded each thread, preserved original metadata, saved copies to a secure archive. Her process remained consistent. Collect, verify, store, no interpretation yet. At 12:15 p.m., her phone vibrated. A call from an unknown number. Stella answered. "Miss Carter," a male voice asked. "Yes. This is Daniel Reeves from Carter Logistics. I'm calling to confirm your availability for a preliminary check-in tomorrow." Daniel Reeves, Senior Operations Liaison. He would not have called unless prompted. "I'm available," Stella said. "Excellent. There are a few final clarifications the board would like to align on before the signing window opens." "Understood." A pause. Then, and Miss Carter, Daniel added, his tone careful, "We want to ensure that all communication regarding the transaction remains appropriately contained." Stella recognized the phrasing, not a warning, a precaution. "It will," she said. The call ended. She made a note. Board aware of sensitivity, containment reinforced, which meant one thing. Someone had noticed movement. Not enough to disrupt the deal, but enough to require attention. Stella did not assume it was Joseph, or Rebecca, or anyone specific. Assumptions reduced accuracy. She worked only with what could be confirmed. The afternoon passed without interruption. By 3:40 p.m., Stella had completed a full reconstruction of the past 3 months. Financial activity, communication flow, behavioral patterns, each mapped against the others. The result was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was consistent. And consistency, when aligned across multiple systems, formed structure. She reviewed the compiled file once, then attached it to a new email. Recipient Eleanor Hayes. Subject, preliminary evidence. Structured timeline. No additional message. The attachment spoke for itself. She sent it. The response came within minutes. Received, reviewing. Do not engage. Preserve all channels. Stella closed the email. That instruction aligned with her own approach. No engagement. Not yet. At 5:12 p.m., Joseph called. This time Stella answered. "Stella," he said, his voice measured, but edged with something less controlled. "We need to talk." "We will," she replied. A pause. "Soon," he added. Yes. Another pause. I didn't expect things to escalate like this, Joseph said. Stella considered the word. Escalate. As if events had accelerated beyond intention. They followed a sequence, she said. That's not what I mean, he replied. Frustration surfacing. You're acting like this is some kind of process. It is. Joseph exhaled sharply. This is our marriage. Stella did not respond immediately. Then it was. Silence on both ends. Joseph spoke again, quieter now. Rebecca didn't. This wasn't planned the way it looks. Stella's gaze remained steady, though he could not see it. Appearances often reflect structure more accurately than intention. That's not fair. No, Stella said. It's observable. Joseph had no immediate answer. I thought you understood, he said finally. I do. Then why does it feel like you're already somewhere else? Stella glanced at her notebook, at the entries, at the timeline. Because I am. She ended the call, not abruptly, but without extension. There was nothing further to clarify. That evening, Stella reviewed her notes one final time. Everything was in place. Not complete, but aligned. She wrote one more entry. Communication confirmed. Financial verified access exceeded. Intent implied. Then she paused and added, engagement deferred because the moment for response had not yet arrived. But it would. And when it did, it would not require volume, only documentation. Richard Carter had never believed in visible control. He believed in structure, the kind that remained unnoticed until someone attempted to bypass it. Stella understood that now, more clearly than she had when he first explained it to her years ago in an office that no longer existed. Back then, she had been younger, not inexperienced, but not yet shaped by the accumulation of observation that would later define her decisions. People don't reveal themselves when everything is working, Richard had said, standing beside a window that overlooked a freight terminal he had spent decades building into relevance. They reveal themselves when they think something is about to become accessible. Stella had listened, not questioning, not interrupting. And when they miscalculate access, he continued, they accelerate their behavior. That's when structure matters. He had not been speaking about any specific person. He had been speaking about everyone, including though neither of them had said it aloud at the time the possibility of someone like Joseph. The Carter logistics holding structure was not complex for the sake of appearance. It was precise by design. At its core was a trust layered, insulated, and bound by conditions that were not immediately visible to those outside its drafting. Ownership in the traditional sense was not the primary mechanism. Authority was, and authority, in Stella's case, had never been transferable through marriage. Joseph had never asked to see the full documentation. He had not needed to. He assumed. That assumption had been reinforced by proximity, by lifestyle, by the natural blending of personal and professional spaces that often occurs in marriages where one partner operates within high-value transactions. He had seen the meetings. He had heard fragments of discussions. He had observed the scale. And from that, he had constructed a version of reality in which he was included. Not formally, but inevitably. Stella had never corrected him, not because she intended to mislead, but because correction without inquiry often creates unnecessary attention. Richard had taught her that as well. Let people reveal the version they're working from, he had said. It tells you more than what they claim to understand. Now, sitting at her desk with the compiled records from the past week, Stella revisited the original trust documentation. Not to confirm what she already knew, but to align it with what had been triggered. She opened the file. The language was unchanged, formal, exact, structured to anticipate scenarios without naming them directly. Clauses related to authority were clear. Final execution rights remained solely with her. No proxy authorization permitted. No automatic extension through marital status. But further down in sections less frequently referenced were conditions. Protective clauses. They did not use emotional language. They did not reference betrayal, abandonment, or intent. They referenced behavior, documented behavior, unauthorized access attempts, misrepresentation of authority, financial activity suggesting anticipatory use of non-granted assets. And one clause in particular stood apart, not because it was more important, but because it was more specific. In the event of documented personal abandonment during a period of critical operational responsibility, any indirect claims to future financial benefit through relational association would be void. Stella read that sentence twice, not because it was unclear, but because of its timing. Hospital, departure, public alignment. Each element, when viewed separately, might have been interpreted as circumstantial. Together they formed documentation. Richard had not predicted Joseph. He had predicted behavior. And behavior, when aligned with opportunity, followed patterns. Stella closed the document. Her reflection appeared faintly in the darkened screen. Not changed, not altered, just confirmed. Her phone vibrated. A message from Eleanor Hayes. Review complete. Structure supports immediate protective action if required. Recommend holding until post-confirmation as discussed. Stella read it once, then replied, Agreed. Proceed with preparation. No filing yet. Timing remained central, not for advantage, for alignment. At 11:20 a.m., Stella left her apartment for the first time since her discharge. The city felt unchanged, which was expected. Personal shifts rarely register at scale. She arrived at a private office building downtown neutral, discreet, the kind of place designed for conversations that did not require visibility. Eleanor Hayes was already there. She stood as Stella entered, extending a hand briefly. Good to see you upright, Eleanor said. Stability has returned, Stella replied. They sat, no small talk, no unnecessary transition. Eleanor opened a folder. I've reviewed everything you sent, she said. The timeline is consistent. The financial activity supports inquiry. The communication overlap is useful. Stella nodded. Eleanor continued. The trust structure is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It doesn't prevent behavior. It contains its consequences. Understood. Eleanor paused, then added, The hospital incident strengthens your position. Not emotionally, structurally. Stella met her gaze. Yes, public setting, documented presence, witnesses, timing relative to the transaction. Each point was delivered without emphasis, because emphasis was not required. Eleanor closed the folder. The question is not whether you have standing, she said. You do. The question is when you choose to act on it. Stella considered to that. After confirmation, she said. Eleanor nodded. That aligns with the strongest position. A brief silence followed. Then Eleanor asked, Do you anticipate any direct engagement from him before then? Yes. And her yes. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. Do not respond beyond what is necessary to maintain documentation, she said. No explanations, no corrections. Understood. Because explanations, Stella knew, often diluted structure. They introduced variables, emotion, interpretation, none of which were required. The meeting concluded shortly after. No extended discussion, no contingency planning beyond what had already been established, because the framework was already in place. It only required execution. As Stella left the building, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was not a message. It was a notification. A public post. Rebecca. Stella opened it. A photo, not posed, not formal. Joseph and Rebecca seated close together at a cafe, sunlight filtering through the window behind them. The caption, Sometimes clarity comes from letting go of what no longer fits. The comments had already begun. Agreement, encouragement, interpretation. Stella read none of them. She did not need to. The image itself was sufficient. Alignment, public, documented. She took a screenshot, saved it, time-stamped, then closed the app. Because what Rebecca believed she was doing was contributing to narrative. But what she was actually doing was contributing to record. Stella returned home, her movements unchanged, her pace consistent. She placed her phone on the table, opened her notebook, and wrote, "Trust confirmed clause, activated behavior aligned, public record expanding." Then she paused and added, "Position secured," because what had once been assumption was now structure. And structure did not require defense. Public spaces had always been Joseph Whitmore's advantage. He understood how to occupy them, how to adjust tone, posture, expression, depending on the audience in front of him. In those environments, perception moved faster than verification, and confidence often replaced accuracy. That week, he relied on that advantage more than ever. The engagement event was not announced formally. It didn't need to be. Invitations moved through private channels, text messages, quiet calls, selective inclusion. The setting was a midtown rooftop lounge, understated but expensive in a way that signaled access without overt display. Rebecca had chosen it. "It feels more intimate," she had said, when Joseph asked, "Why not something larger?" What she meant was controlled. Every guest had a role, every conversation had a direction, and every absence had an explanation already prepared. Stella's absence, in particular, had been accounted for. "She's focusing on her work right now," Rebecca told one guest early in the evening. "We've both moved on in different ways." The phrasing was deliberate. No accusation, no conflict, just conclusion. Joseph repeated a similar version when asked directly. "It's been over for a while," he said, his tone calm, almost reflective. "We just didn't put a label on it until now." No one challenged him, because in rooms like this, narrative often settles before facts arrive. Rebecca moved easily through the space. Her presence measured, her attention evenly distributed. She did not dominate conversations. She guided them. When someone expressed concern about the speed of events, she responded with softness. "Sometimes clarity doesn't wait for the right timing," she said. "It just arrives." It sounded like honesty. It functioned as reinforcement. Joseph watched her reassured. This, he believed, was alignment. This was what had been missing before. Not structure, not restraint, but ease. What he did not see, what he could not recognize, was that the same room that amplified his confidence also contained variables he did not control. Several attendees that evening were not social contacts. They were adjacent to the deal. Not directly involved, but close enough to observe patterns that extended beyond personal relationships. One of them, Daniel Reeves, stood near the far edge of the terrace, speaking quietly with a colleague. His attention shifted occasionally not toward Joseph, but toward the broader arrangement. Rebecca, Joseph, the way others responded to them. He did not interrupt. He did not question. He noted. Because in his position, observation preceded engagement. At 8:12 p.m., Joseph received a message. A brief notification from his bank. He glanced at it, his expression unchanged. A minor delay on a pending transfer, nothing unusual. He returned to the conversation. At 8:27 p.m., a second notification. This time, a request for additional verification on a larger transaction. Joseph frowned slightly. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away from the group. He moved toward a quieter corner, pulling out his phone. The message was clear. A scheduled transfer had been placed on hold, pending authorization confirmation. He tapped through the app, expecting a simple verification process. Instead, he encountered a prompt he had not seen before. Authorization required primary account holder confirmation. Joseph paused. Primary account holder. He had seen the designation before, but never considered its limitation. He attempted to proceed. The system did not allow it. He exited the app, reopened it. Same result. A moment of irritation surfaced. He dismissed it. A technical delay. Nothing more. Behind him, the event continued. Rebecca laughed at something someone said, her tone light, her posture relaxed. She had not noticed Joseph's shift in attention. Not yet. At 8:41 p.m., a third notification. This one was different. An email. Subject line, transaction review. Pending clarification, Joseph opened it. The language was formal, structured, The requested transaction exceeded authorized thresholds based on current account designation. Additional documentation required for processing. He read it twice. Then again. The phrasing did not align with his expectations. He had operated under the assumption that his access would expand in parallel with the changes in his personal life. That assumption had not been challenged. Until now. He looked up. The room appeared unchanged. Conversations continued. Music played softly in the background. Nothing in the environment reflected the shift occurring within his access. Rebecca approached him, her expression attentive. "Everything okay?" she asked. Joseph hesitated, then nodded. "Just a delay," he said. "Banking issue." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "Is it something that needs to be handled now?" "Probably," he replied. "I just need to confirm a few things." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. Then she smiled. "Take your time. I'll manage here." Manage. The word settled differently this time. Joseph stepped away again, moving toward the exit of the terrace. He needed clarity, not reassurance. He called the bank. After a brief wait, a representative answered. He explained the situation, his tone controlled but firm. The representative listened, then responded with equal calm. "Mr. Whitmore, the account you're referencing requires confirmation from the primary holder for transactions of this scale." "I have access to the account," Joseph said. "You have secondary access," the representative clarified. "Authorization thresholds remain with the primary holder." Joseph's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "And who is listed as the primary holder?" A brief pause. Then Miss Stella Carter. The name did not surprise him. The designation did. "I'm her husband," Joseph said. "I understand," the representative replied. "However, marital status does not alter authorization structure on this account." Joseph ended the call. Not abruptly, but without resolution. He stood there for a moment, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass beside him. The assumption he had been operating under had not been confirmed. It had been untested, and now it was being restricted. Behind him, the event continued without interruption. Rebecca had shifted seamlessly into his absence, maintaining the tone, the flow, the perception of stability. No one questioned where he had gone, because absence in that context could still be interpreted as control. Joseph returned to the group minutes later. His expression had adjusted, not entirely composed, but close enough. Rebecca met his gaze immediately. A question unspoken. He gave a small nod, not explanation, not yet, but acknowledgement. Something had changed. She felt it, not in the room, but in him. Across the city, in a quiet apartment that had not hosted a single guest that evening, Stella closed her laptop. The confirmation she had been waiting for had arrived. Not through direct communication, not through confrontation, but through system response. Access restricted, authorization clarified, structure holding. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Financial trigger activated. Access denied, secondary primary authority confirmed." Then she paused and added, "Public distraction ongoing." Because while Joseph and Rebecca continued to build narrative, the system was beginning to respond. Not loudly, not visibly, but precisely, and precision did not require announcement. The wedding was arranged in less than 10 days. Not because it needed to be, because it was expected to be. Speed in Joseph's mind created legitimacy. It replaced hesitation with momentum, gave structure to what might otherwise appear impulsive. The faster events aligned, the less space there was for doubt to surface. Rebecca understood that instinct. She did not question the timeline. She refined it. The venue was secured quickly, a private estate just outside the city, enclosed, elegant, removed from public intrusion, but still accessible enough for their chosen guests. The kind of place where appearances could be shaped without interruption. Invitations were not sent in traditional form. They were extended, quietly, directly. Those who mattered would attend. Those who questioned would not be included. The narrative had already been prepared. They've both moved on, It was mutual. It's been over longer than anyone realized. Each version slightly different. Each one consistent in direction. Stella's name appeared only when necessary. And when it did, it was framed carefully. With distance, with finality. Joseph stood at the center of it all, moving through preparations with a confidence that had not yet been challenged directly. The earlier issue with the bank delay's verification requirements had unsettled him, but only briefly. He had explained it away. Administrative lag, system updates, temporary restriction, nothing structural, nothing permanent, because to accept otherwise would require reconsidering the foundation he had already committed to. Rebecca noticed the shift, though she did not address it directly. Not yet. Instead, she focused on execution, details, timing, guest flow. She maintained control of the environment. Joseph maintained control of the narrative. Together, they believed they were aligned. The morning of the wedding arrived without complication. Clear sky, controlled setting, everything arranged to reflect certainty. Guests arrived in measured intervals, greeted by staff trained to anticipate needs without drawing attention. Conversations began before the ceremony, quiet assessments layered beneath polite exchanges. Some attendees had not seen Joseph in weeks. Others had seen him recently, but only within the context of the emerging narrative. Few had seen Stella. And those who had said nothing. At 2:14 p.m., Joseph stood in a private room overlooking the estate grounds, adjusting his cufflinks. The mirror reflected a version of him that matched the image he intended to present, composed, assured, unaffected. His phone rested on the table beside him. Silent, for now. Rebecca entered a few minutes later. Her dress was understated but intentional. Nothing excessive. Nothing that required explanation. She paused briefly at the doorway, observing him. "You look ready," she said. Joseph nodded. "So do you." She stepped closer, her expression steady. "This is the right decision," she added. It was not a question. Joseph met her gaze. "Yes," he said. The word came easily, because it had been repeated often enough to settle. Outside, guests began to take their seats. The ceremony space had been arranged to emphasize openness rows, aligned toward a central aisle, natural light filtering through the surrounding trees. The setting suggested clarity, transparency, nothing hidden. At 2:32 p.m., Joseph's phone vibrated. A notification. He glanced at it. A bank alert. Another. Then a third. His expression shifted slightly, but enough. Rebecca noticed. "What is it?" she asked. "Just a delay," he said almost automatically. "Same issue as before." She held his gaze. "Are you sure it's nothing more?" Joseph exhaled. "I'll check it after," he said. "This isn't the time." Rebecca nodded, but the question did not leave her. The ceremony began at 2:45 p.m. The officiant spoke with measured cadence, guiding the moment without drawing attention to anything beyond the surface. Words about commitment, alignment, shared future. Joseph repeated his vows with clarity, confidence. Rebecca followed her tone, steady, her posture composed. From a distance, it appeared seamless. No interruption, no visible hesitation, no indication that anything beyond the ceremony itself existed. But beneath that, systems continued to move. At 3:08 p.m., as the final words were spoken and the formal structure of the ceremony concluded, Joseph's phone vibrated again. This time, he did not ignore it. He stepped slightly aside, unlocking the screen. An email. Subject line, authorization status, final notice. He opened it. The message was longer than the previous ones, more direct. Due to recent account activity and verification inconsistencies, all pending transactions exceeding secondary authorization thresholds have been placed on hold. Pending confirmation from the primary account holder. Joseph read the line again. Primary account holder. The phrase had appeared before, but now it was being enforced. He scrolled further. Additional language followed. Clarification regarding account structure, limitations of access. No mention of marriage, no mention of assumed inclusion. Just designation. Defined. Unchanged. Rebecca approached him again, her expression more focused now. "Joseph," she said quietly, What's happening? He hesitated, then showed her the screen. She read it, once, then again. Her expression did not change dramatically. But something in it recalibrated. "This doesn't look like a delay," she said. Joseph shook his head slightly. "It's just verification. They need confirmation." "From Stella," Rebecca said. "Not a question. A conclusion." Joseph did not respond immediately, because the name carried weight now, not emotional, structural. Around them, the reception had begun. Guests moved toward the main hall. Music shifted. Voices rose slightly in volume. Everything continued, as if nothing had changed. Rebecca lowered the phone slowly. "Have you spoken to her?" she asked. Joseph's jaw tightened. "No." "Then you should." The suggestion was calm, reasonable, necessary. Joseph looked past her toward the crowd, the space, the event that had just confirmed a decision he believed was final. Then back at the screen, at the language, at the limitation. "I'll handle it," he said. Rebecca held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. But the alignment between them had shifted. Not broken, not yet, but no longer assumed. Across the city, Stella sat at her desk, the room unchanged, the light outside beginning to fade. Her phone remained silent. No calls, no messages, because the system did not require her presence to respond. It only required her designation. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Ceremony completed, access restricted, confirmed dependency exposed." Then she paused and added, "Contact pending," because Joseph would call. Not out of reflection, not out of understanding, but out of necessity. And necessity revealed more clearly than intention ever could. The reception continued as planned. Music filled the space. Glasses were raised. Conversations moved in steady currents across the room, carrying fragments of approval, curiosity, and quiet speculation. To anyone observing from a distance, nothing appeared disrupted. Joseph Whitmore stood among them, newly married, composed in posture, if not in thought. The phone remained in his hand longer than it should have. Rebecca noticed, not the device itself, the way his attention kept returning to it. "You can step outside," she said quietly, her voice controlled, almost supportive. "No one will question it." Joseph nodded. He moved through the room without drawing attention, exiting through a side corridor that led to a quieter terrace overlooking the estate grounds. The air outside was cooler, the noise softened to a distant hum. He checked the screen again. Another email. This one marked with higher priority. Subject line: Formal Notice Authority Clarification. Joseph opened it immediately. The message was not from the bank. It was from legal counsel associated with Carter Logistics. The language was precise, unemotional, and final in tone. This communication serves as formal clarification that Mr. Joseph Whitmore holds no legal authority, direct or indirect, in relation to the Carter Logistics acquisition currently pending execution. All authorization rights remain exclusively with Miss Stella Carter as designated under existing trust and corporate governance structures. Joseph read the paragraph once. Then again, the words did not change. They did not soften. They did not leave space for interpretation. He continued reading. Any attempt to initiate, authorize, or anticipate access to assets associated with this transaction without express confirmation from the designated authority will be considered outside the scope of permissible activity and subject to review. Further language followed. References to documentation, to observed patterns, to timelines. Then a line that slowed his reading. Recent events including documented personal disengagement during a period of critical operational responsibility have been noted in relation to applicable protective clauses. Joseph's grip tightened slightly. The hospital. The phrasing did not name it directly, but it did not need to. It had been recorded, observed, aligned. He lowered the phone. For a moment, he did not move. The air around him remained still, the distant sound of the reception continuing without interruption. Inside, the narrative he had constructed, carefully, confidently began to shift. Not collapse, not yet, but reconfigure. Rebecca stepped onto the terrace moments later. She closed the door behind her, the noise dimming further. "Joseph," she said, her tone quieter now, more focused. "You've been gone too long." He handed her the phone without speaking. She took it, read, paused, then read again. Her expression remained composed, but the stillness in it deepened. "This is from their legal team," she said. "Yes, and it's explicit. Yes." She lowered the phone slowly. "They're saying you have no access." She continued. "Yes, no indirect authority. Yes." Rebecca exhaled, her gaze shifting briefly toward the horizon before returning to him. "And they're referencing the hospital," she added. Joseph did not respond, because there was nothing to clarify. The connection had been made, not emotionally, structurally. Rebecca's posture adjusted subtly, but noticeably. "What does this mean for the deal?" she asked. Joseph hesitated, because until that moment, the deal had not required definition. It had existed as expectation. Now it required understanding. "It means—" He began, then stopped. He recalibrated. "It means Stella has to confirm everything." Rebecca held his gaze. "And if she doesn't?" Joseph did not answer immediately, because that question had not been considered before. "Not fully." "She will," he said finally. The certainty in his voice was present, but thinner, less grounded. Rebecca studied him for a moment longer, then spoke again. "Have you spoken to her?" "No." "Then you need to." The statement was direct now, no longer softened. Joseph nodded. He took the phone back, scrolled through his contacts, found her name, Stella. He hesitated, just long enough for the weight of the moment to register. Then he called. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times, then connected. "Stella," he said, his voice controlled but no longer neutral. "We need to talk." On the other end, Stella sat at her desk, the same position she had maintained for most of the evening. Her notebook open, her laptop closed. The call had been expected, not anticipated with urgency, but accounted for. "We will," she said. Her tone was steady, unchanged. Joseph exhaled. "There's been a misunderstanding," he continued, "regarding the deal." "No," Stella replied. A pause. Then, "There hasn't." The words landed without force, but with precision. Joseph tightened his grip on the phone. "They're saying I don't have authorization," he said. "They're correct, and the accounts are structured accordingly." Joseph stepped further away from the door, lowering his voice instinctively. "Stella, this affects both of us." There was a brief silence. Then, "No," she said. "It affects structure." Joseph closed his eyes briefly. "This isn't about structure," he insisted. "This is about access," Stella said. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt. She completed the sentence. Joseph stopped, because that word aligned everything. "You knew?" he asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." Joseph exhaled sharply. "You should have told me." Stella's gaze remained steady, though he could not see it. "You didn't ask." Silence. Not empty, not uncertain, just present. Rebecca stood a few steps away, watching, listening without appearing to. Her expression had shifted again, not outwardly, but internally. Joseph spoke again, his tone lower now. "This doesn't have to become complicated," he said. "We can resolve this." Stella considered the word, resolve, as if the situation required negotiation. "It already is resolved," she said. "How?" he asked. "Through designation." Joseph's frustration surfaced again. "This is still our life," he said. "Our marriage." "It isn't," Stella replied. The interruption was minimal, but final. Joseph stopped. The statement did not carry emotion. It did not require it. It carried conclusion. Rebecca stepped closer, her presence no longer peripheral. "Stella," she said, her voice calm, measured. "We're just trying to understand the situation." Stella did not respond immediately. "Then you are," she said. The distinction was subtle, but deliberate. Rebecca held the phone's silence for a moment, then stepped back. Joseph spoke again. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Stella looked at the notebook in front of her, at the entries, at the alignment. Nothing she said. The words settled. Clear, complete. Joseph's breath caught slightly. "Then what happens now?" Stella closed the notebook. Now she said the process continues. She ended the call, not abruptly, not with emphasis, just completion. On the terrace, Joseph lowered the phone slowly. The reception behind him continued, unchanged. Rebecca watched him, not with uncertainty, but with recalculation, because what had just been clarified was not emotional. It was structural, and structure did not respond to persuasion. The shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived through documentation. The morning after the wedding, while the remnants of celebration still lingered in photographs and quiet conversations, Eleanor Hayes initiated the first formal actions. Not public, not aggressive, precise, targeted. Requests were filed, not accusations, not yet, but inquiries supported by documented irregularities. Financial institutions received notices requiring preservation of records. Transaction histories were flagged for review. Access logs were secured before they could be altered. The system responded as it always did when approached correctly. Not emotionally, procedurally. Joseph became aware of it at 9:18 a.m. He was seated at a table in the estate's smaller dining room. Rebecca across from him, a plate untouched between them. The morning light filtered in through tall windows, casting a stillness that contrasted sharply with the previous night's movement. His phone vibrated. Then again, he checked the screen. Multiple notifications, bank alerts, email confirmations, a message from an institution he had not contacted. Subject line, record preservation notice pending review. He opened it. The language was unfamiliar in tone, but not in implication. Due to recent activity, relevant financial records associated with specified accounts will be preserved for review. No changes to account structure or transaction history will be permitted until further notice. Joseph read it once. Then again. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, her voice quieter now, less certain than it had been days before. He handed her the phone. She read. Her expression did not shift dramatically, but the stillness in it deepened again. "They're freezing movement," she said. "Not freezing," Joseph replied. "Preserving." The distinction was technical, but it mattered. Rebecca looked at him. And why would they do that? Joseph did not answer immediately, because the answer was forming. Not from assumption, but from alignment. His phone vibrated again. Another email, this time from a different source. A legal firm, not Eleanor Hayes, but associated. Request for clarification regarding recent financial activity exceeding authorized thresholds. Joseph's jaw tightened. "They're reviewing transactions," he said. Rebecca set the phone down slowly. "Joseph, what exactly did you access?" The question was calm, but no longer supportive. It required an answer. "Nothing I wasn't allowed to," he said. The words came quickly. Too quickly. Rebecca held his gaze. "And what were you allowed to?" Joseph looked away briefly, then back. "Secondary access," he said. Rebecca nodded once. "And you assumed that would change." It was not a question. Joseph did not respond, because assumption was no longer defensible. Across the city, Stella sat in a conference room. Not large, not formal, but controlled. Eleanor Hayes sat across from her, a series of documents arranged in front of her with the same precision Stella recognized immediately. "Initial responses have been received," Eleanor said. "Financial institutions are cooperating. Records are intact." Stella nodded. Eleanor continued. "The pattern is consistent with anticipatory use. No emphasis, no judgment, just classification." "Do we proceed to formal filing?" Stella asked. "Not yet," Eleanor replied. "We allow the documentation to consolidate." Stella understood. Pressure applied too early could disrupt alignment. Timing remained critical. Eleanor slid a folder across the table. "Additional material," she said. Stella opened it. Inside transcripts, audio logs, legally obtained. Voicemail recordings, conversation fragments, not edited, not interpreted, raw. The first recording began with Joseph's voice, casual, unaware. Once the deal clears, it won't matter. Everything shifts after that. Rebecca's voice followed. Are you sure you'll have access? A pause. Then Joseph again. It's inevitable. We're married. It's all connected. Another recording, shorter. Rebecca speaking. She's at the hospital now. That might actually simplify things. Joseph's response. Then we don't delay. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. They aligned. Stella listened without visible reaction, not because it did not register, but because it confirmed. Eleanor watched her. Timing is evident, she said. Awareness is implied. Intent is supported. Stella closed the folder. Understood. Eleanor leaned back slightly. We proceed when you're ready, she added. Stella considered that. Then after signing. Eleanor nodded. Then we maintained position. The meeting concluded shortly after. No escalation, no deviation. Because everything was already in motion. Back at the estate, Joseph stood near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. I need to understand what this means, he said, his tone controlled but strained. The voice on the other end responded calmly. It means your accounts are under review, Mr. Whitmore. Until that review is complete, no further transactions of significance will be processed. This is temporary, Joseph said. All measures are procedural, the voice replied. Which meant nothing and everything. Joseph ended the call. Rebecca stood nearby, watching, not intervening. What did they say, she asked. Joseph exhaled. They're reviewing everything. Rebecca nodded slowly, and Stella Joseph looked at her. What about her? She initiated this, Rebecca said. The statement was quiet, but direct. Joseph did not respond, because the possibility had already formed. He just had not named it. Rebecca continued. She knew, she said, about the structure, about the access, about all of it. Joseph's silence confirmed more than denial would have. Rebecca stepped back slightly, not physically distant, but recalibrated. This wasn't what you said it would be, she added. Joseph turned toward her. I didn't know. The words were immediate, but incomplete. Rebecca held his gaze. You didn't ask, she said. The echo of Stella's words, unintended, but aligned. Across the city, Stella returned to her apartment. The afternoon light had shifted, longer shadows, quieter tone. She placed the folder on the table, opened her notebook, and wrote, Financial review, active records, preserved audio, confirmed, intent aligned. Then she paused and added, response pending execution, because what had been revealed was no longer hidden. Not to her, not to the system, and not for much longer to anyone else. The legal room did not resemble the spaces where Joseph had built his confidence. There were no open terraces, no curated lighting, no movement designed to soften perception. The room was enclosed, deliberate, structured for one purpose: alignment through documentation. No one spoke until everything was in place. Folders arranged, screens prepared, names confirmed. Stella sat at one side of the table, her posture unchanged from any other setting she had occupied. Eleanor Hayes sat beside her, reviewing a set of documents with quiet precision. Across from them, Joseph Whitmore adjusted his seat slightly, his movements controlled, but not entirely composed. Rebecca Lawson sat beside him, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm, but less certain than it had been in previous days. Their legal representation occupied the remaining seats. Introductions were minimal. The process began without preamble. This is a preliminary review. Eleanor stated, her tone even. No conclusions are being asserted beyond documented alignment. No accusation, no performance, just structure. A screen at the far end of the room illuminated. Timeline, dates, transactions, communications, each element presented without commentary. Joseph watched. At first, his attention moved quickly, scanning, attempting to process, to identify inconsistencies he could challenge. But there were none. Because the structure did not rely on interpretation. It relied on alignment. This represents financial activity across a 3-month period, Eleanor continued, cross-referenced with access logs and declared schedules. Joseph leaned forward slightly. I'd like to clarify. You will have the opportunity, Eleanor said, not interrupting, but not yielding the sequence. Joseph leaned back. The presentation continued. A series of transactions appeared. Dates, amounts, locations. Then calendar entries, Joseph's, placed beside them. The overlap did not accuse. It revealed. Rebecca's gaze remained on the screen. Not shifting, not avoiding, just following. Because avoidance would have required denial, and denial required inconsistency. There was none. Eleanor paused. Next, she said, communication records, emails, threads, forwarded messages, fragments of information that individually appeared insignificant. Together, they formed pattern. Rebecca spoke for the first time. These are incomplete, she said. There's no context for how those messages were used. Eleanor nodded slightly. Correct, she said. Context is not required for pattern recognition. Rebecca held her gaze. That's a selective interpretation. No, Eleanor replied. It's structural alignment. Silence followed, not tense, not unresolved, just settled. Joseph shifted again. This still doesn't prove intent, he said. Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned to the final section. Audio. The room remained still as the first recording played. Joseph's voice. Clear, unaltered. Once the deal clears, it won't matter. Rebecca's voice. Are you sure you'll have access? Then it's inevitable. We're married. The recording ended. No one spoke, because the words required no explanation. Eleanor closed the file. Intent, she said, is not required to establish structural misuse. Joseph's jaw tightened. That was a private conversation? Yes, Eleanor said, now documented. Rebecca's posture changed slightly, not visibly to anyone unfamiliar with her, but enough. This doesn't reflect the full situation, she said. There were assumptions made, misunderstandings. Eleanor looked at her. Assumptions, she repeated. Noted. Rebecca continued. I was not aware of the full structure. I was told. She stopped, because the sentence had no stable conclusion. Joseph turned toward her. You're saying I misled you? Rebecca met his gaze. I'm saying I didn't have complete information. The distinction was careful, but not neutral. Joseph looked away, because the room did not respond to positioning, only to alignment. Stella had not spoken, not once. Her attention remained on the table in front of her, the documents, the sequence, the structure, as it unfolded exactly as expected. Eleanor glanced at her briefly, then continued. Based on the presented material, she said, we are establishing the following unauthorized anticipatory financial activity. Misrepresentation of access authority. Documented alignment of behavior preceding and following a critical operational period. Joseph exhaled. This is being framed, he said. Eleanor shook her head slightly. It is being presented. There was a difference. And in that room, it mattered. Joseph leaned forward again. This still doesn't justify. It does not need to justify, Eleanor said. It establishes. Rebecca's gaze shifted for the first time toward Stella. You haven't said anything, she said. The statement was not confrontational. It was searching. Stella lifted her eyes, met Rebecca's gaze. Then I'm confirming. The word was quiet, but final. Rebecca held her gaze. For what she asked. Stella's answer came without delay. What is already aligned? Rebecca's expression shifted again, not visibly to most, but internally it settled. Joseph spoke again, his tone lower now. What happens next? Eleanor answered. Next, the process continues. Joseph looked at Stella. For the first time, not with frustration, not with expectation, but with something closer to recognition. You're not going to negotiate this, he said. It was not a question. Stella did not respond immediately. Then no. The word carried no weight beyond itself, because none was required. Joseph leaned back. The room remained still. No escalation, no raised voices, no dramatic shift, just conclusion forming. Rebecca spoke once more. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. Eleanor responded. "It means the structure will proceed without reliance on assumption." Rebecca nodded slowly, because that answer contained everything. The meeting concluded shortly after. No resolution declared, no outcome announced, because outcomes in that room were not stated. They were executed. As they stood to leave, Joseph hesitated, not moving immediately, not speaking, just present. Then he turned, walked toward the door. Rebecca followed, a step behind, not aligned, not separate, just repositioned. Stella remained seated for a moment longer. Eleanor closed the folder beside her. "Everything's in place," she said. Stella nodded. "Yes." Eleanor looked at her. "Are you ready to proceed?" Stella stood. Her movements unchanged, her posture steady. "Yes," she said, because what had been observed had been confirmed. And what had been confirmed did not require further discussion, only execution. The signing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., not at a public venue, not at a place designed for visibility or announcement. It took place in a private executive conference room on the 32nd floor of a building that did not display its significance from the outside. Inside, everything was prepared. Documents arranged in exact sequence. Digital copies secured across multiple systems. Representatives from each entity present not for ceremony, but for confirmation. No one arrived early. No one arrived late. Precision did not allow for either. Stella entered at 8:57 a.m. She wore the same kind of attire she had worn for years, structured, understated, free of any element that could be interpreted as symbolic. There was no visual indication that this moment differed from any other professional obligation. But the room adjusted slightly when she stepped inside. Not visibly, but in attention. Daniel Reeves stood near the far end of the table, reviewing a final set of documents. He looked up as she approached, offering a brief nod. "Miss Carter," he said, "we're ready." Stella nodded once. She took her seat. Eleanor Hayes sat to her right, a slim folder placed in front of her untouched for the moment. Across the table, representatives from the acquiring firm Legal Financial Operational waited in quiet readiness. Their posture reflected expectation, not uncertainty. Because this stage was not about negotiation. It was about execution. At 9:00 a.m., the lead counsel began. "Final confirmation of authority," he said, his tone formal but measured. "Ms. Carter, do you confirm your capacity as sole authorized signatory under the Carter Logistics Trust structure?" Stella met his gaze. "Yes." No elaboration, no hesitation. The confirmation was recorded, digital systems updated, a sequence initiated, documents were presented one by one. Each page reviewed not for discovery, but for alignment. Stella read everything, not because she needed to verify, but because she maintained process. Signature followed review. Each movement deliberate, each action recorded. The room remained silent, except for the controlled rhythm of pages turning pens, moving keys, registering entries into secured systems. Eleanor observed, not intervening, not guiding, because there was nothing left to guide. This moment was Stella's. Across the city, Joseph Whitmore sat in a space that no longer reflected control. His apartment, temporary, now transitional, felt different, not physically, structurally. He had spent the early morning making calls, banks, legal contacts, anyone who might provide clarity. The responses had been consistent, procedural, non-negotiable. He sat at the table, his phone resting in front of him, screen dark. Rebecca stood near the window, looking out, her posture still. Neither of them spoke, because the conversation had already taken place. In the legal room, in the recordings, in the structure neither of them had fully understood. At 9:14 a.m., Joseph's phone vibrated. An email. He opened it. Subject line: Transaction execution confirmation. He read. The message was brief. The Carter Logistics acquisition has been formally executed. All associated authority and control remain with the designated signatory. No further action required. Joseph read it twice. Then again, the words did not change. They did not expand. They did not acknowledge him. He lowered the phone slowly. Rebecca turned. What is it, she asked. Joseph met her gaze. It's done, he said. Rebecca's expression did not shift dramatically, but something in it settled, and she asked. Joseph exhaled. And it doesn't involve me. Silence followed. Not sudden, not sharp. Just present. Rebecca walked toward the table, looked at the phone, read the message, then placed it back down. Carefully. So that's it, she said. Not a question. A conclusion. Joseph leaned back in his chair. His posture changed. Not defeated, but recalibrated. Because what he had believed to be imminent had never been available. Rebecca remained standing. Her gaze no longer searching, no longer aligning. Just observing. Everything you said, she began, her voice measured about how this would work. She stopped, because the sentence no longer required completion. Joseph did not respond, because explanation required foundation, and the foundation was gone. Back in the conference room, Stella completed the final signature. The last page, the final confirmation. The process concluded not with applause, not with acknowledgement, but with a simple shift in posture across the room. Daniel Reeves closed his folder. Execution confirmed, he said. No emphasis, no ceremony. Because the significance did not require display. Stella set the pen down. Her hand remained steady, her expression unchanged, not because the moment lacked meaning, but because the meaning had never been external. It had always been process, completion. Eleanor turned slightly toward her. It's done, she said. Stella nodded. Yes. A brief pause followed. Then Eleanor added, Next steps are already in motion. Stella stood. She gathered nothing. No documents, no reminders. Everything she needed was already recorded. As she moved toward the door, the room adjusted again, not visibly, but in recognition, because authority once executed did not need to be asserted. It was understood. Outside, the city continued, unchanged, because outcomes rarely altered environment, only position. Stella stepped into the corridor. The light was different there, less controlled, more natural. She paused briefly, not to reflect, not to reconsider, just to register. Then she continued, because what had been built had now been completed. Not for Joseph, not against Rebecca, but through structure. Across the city, Joseph remained seated, the phone still in front of him, the message still visible. Rebecca moved away from the table, toward the window again, not to observe the view, but to create distance, not physical, structural. Joseph spoke, quietly. I didn't know. Rebecca did not turn. I know she said. The words carried no accusation, but no reassurance, just acknowledgement, because what had been misunderstood had already resolved itself. Without argument, without confrontation, without reversal. And in that resolution, there was no space left for assumption. Only consequence. Consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded in measured intervals, quiet, procedural, unavoidable. The first shift appeared in places Joseph had once considered stable. Calls went unanswered, not abruptly, not rudely, just delayed, then deferred, then replaced with brief, non-committal responses. We'll revisit this later. This may not be the right time. Let's keep communication open, language that avoided conclusion. While confirming distance, Joseph noticed, not immediately, but gradually, because absence when consistent becomes pattern, and pattern becomes position. The financial review continued, not aggressively, not publicly, but thoroughly. Requests expanded, clarifications required, transactions examined beyond initial scope. Not because of accusation, because of alignment. Joseph received the notices one by one. Emails, formal letters, each referencing documentation already submitted, each requesting additional confirmation. The tone remained neutral, but the direction was fixed. He complied at first, provided statements, explained transactions, reconstructed timelines, but explanation without structure did not resolve alignment. It only extended process. Rebecca observed from a distance that was no longer subtle. She remained present, physically. But her engagement had shifted. Questions replaced assumptions. Silence replaced affirmation. "You said this would stabilize after the deal," she said one evening, standing near the kitchen counter, her voice calm. Joseph did not respond immediately, because the premise no longer held. "I expected it to," he said. Rebecca nodded. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. And now she asked. Joseph looked at the table, at the documents spread across it, not organized, not structured, just present. "Now we wait," he said. Rebecca's expression remained steady for what she asked. Joseph had no answer, because waiting required expectation, and expectation required clarity, which he no longer had. Across the city, Stella moved through her days without visible change. Her schedule adjusted, not reduced, refined. Meetings aligned with new responsibilities. Communications increased, but only within defined channels. Nothing expanded beyond structure. Nothing extended beyond necessity. She did not discuss Joseph, not with colleagues, not with Eleanor, not with anyone, because the situation was no longer active. It had been processed, executed. Now it existed as record. Eleanor Hayes continued her work, filings prepared, documentation organized for potential escalation. Not immediate, but available, because readiness was part of structure. One afternoon, Eleanor called. "Preliminary conclusions are forming," she said. Stella listened. "Financial exposure is limited," Eleanor continued. "But reputational impact," she paused, "will extend further." Stella understood, not because she anticipated it, but because it followed. "When does it become visible?" she asked. Eleanor considered. "Soon," she said, "but not through us." Stella nodded, understood, because visibility did not require announcement, only alignment. Joseph experienced it first through absence, then through redirection. A meeting canceled, a partnership reconsidered, an introduction that did not lead to continuation. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, but consistent. He noticed the change in tone, in posture, in response. People no longer leaned toward him in conversation. They listened, then disengaged. Not rudely, not abruptly, just with a distance. Rebecca saw it too, but differently. She was not the subject. She was adjacent, which meant she could observe without immediate consequence, at least initially. Invitations shifted, not withdrawn, repositioned. Events where her presence once added value now required context. Questions asked quietly, answers received cautiously. She adjusted, smiled, maintained composure. Because she understood perception. But perception without structure did not hold. One evening she returned home earlier than expected. Joseph was seated at the table again. The same documents, now slightly more organized, but still incomplete. She placed her bag down, watched him for a moment, then spoke. "This isn't temporary," she said. Joseph looked up. "What isn't this?" she replied, gesturing lightly, not at the papers, not at the room, but at the space between them. Joseph leaned back. "It will stabilize," he said. The words sounded familiar, but less grounded. Rebecca shook her head slightly. "You're still using the same language," she said. Joseph frowned. "What language?" "The kind that assumes outcome without structure." Joseph said nothing, because the observation was accurate. Rebecca stepped closer. "Stella didn't argue," she said. Joseph looked at her. "No," he said. "She didn't explain," Rebecca continued. "No, she didn't even react." Joseph's expression shifted. "Because she didn't need to," Rebecca said. The sentence settled, not heavily but clearly. Joseph looked away. because that he understood now. Not completely, but enough. Across the city, Stella stood in her apartment, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor. Her notebook lay open on the table. Fewer entries now, not because there was less to observe, but because observation was no longer required. She reviewed the last page. Signing completed, structure, confirmed, response executed. Then she added one more line. Closure internal. She closed the notebook, placed it beside the others, not archived, but no longer active. Her phone remained quiet. No calls from Joseph. No messages from Rebecca. Because contact required purpose. And purpose had already shifted. The legal process continued in the background. Not intrusive, not visible, but present. Because consequence did not require attention to exist. It required only time. Joseph felt it most in silence. In the spaces where expectation once existed. Where response used to follow effort. Where presence used to create opportunity. Now, nothing moved, unless supported. And support was no longer assumed. Rebecca stood by the window again, looking out, not searching, not waiting, just observing. Because what had once appeared aligned had revealed itself as conditional, and conditions once exposed did not return to assumption. They remained, defined. Stella turned off the light. The room settled into stillness, not empty, not unresolved, just complete. The transition did not announce itself, nor did it demand recognition from anyone beyond the systems that recorded it. In the weeks that followed, Stella Carter did not make any visible effort to redefine her life, because from her perspective, nothing essential had been taken that required replacement. What had ended was not structure, not identity, and certainly not authority. It had been proximity, and proximity, she understood, was never the same as alignment. The legal dissolution of her marriage proceeded without spectacle. Documents were drafted, reviewed, and finalized with the same precision that had characterized every other process she had engaged in. There were no contested hearings, no extended disputes, no attempts to renegotiate terms that had already been structurally clarified. Joseph Whitmore, for all his earlier resistance, did not prolong the process. Whether that restraint came from understanding or from the quiet accumulation of consequence was not something Stella examined, because motivation did not alter outcome. Their final in-person meeting took place in a neutral office, arranged by their respective legal representatives, a space deliberately chosen to eliminate any suggestion of shared history or emotional context. The room contained only what was necessary: a table, 2 chairs, and a folder placed precisely at the center. Joseph arrived first. He sat, his posture composed, but no longer anchored in the kind of confidence that had once defined him. There was no visible collapse, no overt display of regret, yet something in the way he held himself suggested an awareness that could not be undone. When Stella entered moments later, he stood not out of habit, but out of recognition. She acknowledged him with a brief nod before taking her seat. No greeting was exchanged. No attempt was made to revisit what had already been resolved. The documents were reviewed in silence, each page turned with the same deliberate rhythm that had characterized every other stage of the process. Joseph signed where indicated, his hand steady, his movements controlled. Stella followed her signature, identical in form to the one she had placed on the $600 million agreement, because for her, the act of signing was never symbolic, it was procedural. When the final page was completed, there was a brief pause, not because anything remained unresolved, but because conclusion often creates a moment where continuation has not yet begun. Joseph spoke first. "I thought I understood what mattered," he said, his voice even not seeking sympathy, not offering defense. Stella looked at him, her expression unchanged, her attention precise. "You understood access." She replied, her tone neither critical nor dismissive. "Not structure." Joseph nodded slightly, as though the distinction once articulated required no further explanation. "I didn't see it," he said. "No," Stella answered. "You didn't." The exchange did not escalate, nor did it soften into anything resembling reconciliation. It existed as a statement of fact, aligned with everything that had already been documented. Joseph hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether there was something more to say, some version of acknowledgement that might alter the tone of the moment. But the absence of emotional engagement from Stella left no space for reinterpretation, and eventually he allowed the silence to remain intact. "I hope," he began, then stopped. Stella did not prompt him to continue, because hope, she understood, was not relevant to what had already been completed. He exhaled quietly, then stood stepping back from the table in a movement that signaled not departure alone, but acceptance of position. "Take care of yourself," he said. Stella inclined her head slightly. "I will." There was no further exchange. Joseph left, first the door closing behind him, with a finality that did not require emphasis. Stella remained seated for a moment longer, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but simply to register the completion of a process that had been in motion long before it became visible. When she stood, she did not take the documents with her. They would be handled, archived, and preserved by the appropriate channels. Her role in them had ended. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent to personal transitions, unaffected by private resolutions. Stella stepped into that movement without hesitation, her ace unchanged, her direction clear. She did not return to the apartment she had shared with Joseph. That space had already been released legally, structurally, and personally. Instead, she relocated to a quieter residence, overlooking a part of the city that did not demand attention. The environment was not chosen for symbolism nor for retreat, but for alignment with the rhythm she preferred: controlled, unobtrusive, uninterrupted. Her work continued, not as distraction, not as recovery, but as continuity. The acquisition she had finalized began its integration phase, requiring oversight, adjustment, and long-term planning. Stella engaged with it fully, her attention moving forward rather than returning to what had already been resolved. She did not track Joseph's situation. She did not follow Rebecca's adjustments within social circles that had already begun to reposition themselves, because observation in that context no longer served purpose. The records existed, the outcomes had aligned. Nothing further required confirmation. On an evening several weeks later, Stella stood by the window of her new residence, the city lights extending outward in quiet symmetry. Her notebook rested on the table behind her, closed, not because there was nothing left to record, but because not every phase required documentation. Some required only continuation. She did not consider what had been lost, because loss implies absence of something essential. What had ended had not been essential. It had been misaligned. And misalignment, once recognized, is not restored, it is released. Stella turned away from the window, the room settling into stillness behind her. Not empty, not transitional, but complete in a way that did not require acknowledgement. There was no sense of victory, no internal declaration of closure, only the absence of unresolved structure. And within that absence, there was clarity, not loud, not visible, but sustained. She moved toward the table, her hand resting briefly on the edge as she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Then she continued. Because continuation was the only direction that remained. If this story stayed with you, it may be because it reflects something quiet but true, that strength does not always announce itself, and justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it unfolds through patience, through records, through the steady refusal to react before understanding is complete. Stella never raised her voice, never tried to reclaim dignity through confrontation, and never needed to correct the narrative built around her. What she did instead was observe, document, and allow structure to reveal what emotion could not. There are moments in life when being underestimated feels like loss, but as this story shows, it can also be a form of protection. Not every silence is weakness, and not every absence is defeat. Some are decisions deliberate, controlled, and ultimately defining. If you found meaning in this story, you can let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read those details carefully, just like Stella would. And if you'd like to continue exploring stories where truth unfolds quietly but powerfully, you may choose to stay connected to this channel. No urgency, just continuity.